All right, thank you so much for coming, both those who are in person and online. Welcome. We're very happy to have a chance today to present the report to the community on domestic violence in our region that the UH Institute for Research on Women, Gender, and Sexuality issued this past February. Things have been so packed that we haven't had a chance to get together and go into it in more depth until now. But it's an opportunity to gather some of the participants to talk about it and to welcome questions from the audience. There are many issues embedded, as everyone knows, no doubt, in the topic of domestic violence. So a lot of issues will go unaddressed, sadly, today, but we will cover quite a few and try to connect the dots, as well as provide an overview of the situation of shelters and other service providers in our region, along with some current data on violence. So we're operating on the two platforms, both in terms of panelists as well as audience members. So we'll record this and post it so people can view it later. They're not able to be here today. And you can find an executive summary online, as well as the full report. Just search IRWGS 2023 and pop up. So the program will be in three parts. I will give a presentation, go over an overview of the report. Then we'll have some panel discussions with both participants and other experts in the field, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. So let me start with a big thanks to the 16 domestic violence service providers who participated in the interviews for the first part of the study, exploring how their shelters operated during the pandemic, what they were doing before the pandemic and how it was changed by the pandemic, how they evolved to deal with the issues that the pandemic created, what they learned, and what challenges they face now. Most of them also joined in 2 follow-up workshops to attempt to evolve as a group their sense of what they needed, what was needed in the DV service provision world in our region, and to address the underlying causes of DV, as well as to provide services to people in need now. So let's see. Not to go forward, but one sec. Yes. Okay, so here's a list of all the organizations that participated. And here are the individuals, some of whom are in the room and you'll get to meet later, and others are online. But thanks to all of them for their wonderful participation and input. Also want to say thank you to the shelters and the Sheriff's Office and the Police Department, Houston Police Department, for sharing their anonymized data, which is shared in the second part of the report. Thanks to the City of Houston Mayor's Office for Human Trafficking and Domestic Violence, and to the Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council for all that they do in the community, and for collaborating with IRWGS as well. And thanks to the survivors who have shared their stories in our Parallel DV Survivors study in collaboration with the Houston Area Women's Center. We have learned and continue to learn an enormous amount from you all. Many thanks to my co-workers on this project, Zach Huff and Itzel Martinez, as well as Audrey Miller, Ashwarya Lakshmi, and Claire Kang, and to the IRWGS Advisory Council and our IRWGS supporters. What is the IRWGS? It collects local data and generates research about the ways gender and sexuality viewed intersectionally affect all aspects of life in our region, including workforce, health, wages, family and relationships, social dynamics, reproduction, leadership, and equity. We aim to make data on these topics available to the public online. Much of it hasn't been accessible before, to spark community discussion, engage current and future leaders, transform public policy, and enhance well-being. We've been working with the domestic violence community since 2019, and prior to that, less formally. So please check out our website for more reports on other gender and sexuality issues in our region. I'd also like to thank the Friends of WGSS and the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences and the Carrie C. Stewart Women's Art Park here in the library at UH, which is another key collaborator around documenting women's history in Houston, including the history of domestic violence and the response to it here. So I'll start with an overview. So we attempted to give a kind of synopsis of what the domestic violence providers do in the region. And in the course of working with them, I've learned that they do so much, it's almost inconceivable. So essentially what they do is attempt to build and deliver a safety net for Houstonians and their children fleeing violence. And their work is underwritten by a mixture of philanthropic, federal, and state dollars. But they are underfunded and they can't meet demand for shelter or non-residential services, nor can they address the underlying causes of the demand, though they frequently are asked to, as if they didn't have other things to do. So the high volume of people experiencing domestic violence in this region links to the lack of family support infrastructure, among other things, the lack of affordable housing and the low wages earned by Texas women, because that creates a kind of dependency and especially among people with children that can make people vulnerable, including vulnerability to violence. And so this, as we know, is true at any income level, but it's particularly true for people with low incomes. So one of the things that we were documenting in this report through data from the two major law enforcement groups in the county. There are 83 law enforcement groups in the county, but many of them have very small purviews. So this doesn't, my point being that this does not give a total picture of the regional levels of violence. It just is those that are reported through the two major PDs. And also, we also hear a lot about stories from surrounding counties and surrounding areas. So that's part of the sense that people have that violence is rampant. And here are just a few of the recent cases that really shocked people, I think, got people's attention. And the finding of the study is that, surprise, we need a stronger domestic violence infrastructure to meet survivors' needs and also to begin to attempt to turn the tide on violence. So this report focuses on that, but there are a lot of other steps that have been identified as things that would be helpful across the providers. So we'll come back to that. So currently, what we found was that all of the providers work largely on their own, and that this creates inefficiencies. And so this was in our talking with the providers that out of the discussions came a sense that it would be helpful to move forward with more of a staffing around the core. But I'll come back to this in a minute. Here we go. So you can't fix a problem if you don't know what it is. So what we have been doing is looking at data around calls for service and homicides. And here is the scene from the two police departments in terms of IPP homicides over the past 4 years. So this is before COVID and through COVID and after COVID. So we saw that there's been a particularly big rise in the county data, but also 73% rise in the HPD data and 160% rise in the sheriff's data. So that those add up together to 100% rise in the two combined. And this has been identified as rise as in part due to all the effects of COVID, people being locked in, and all of those things have been much discussed. And then also compounded by the fact that people didn't want to go to shelters because they were afraid of COVID, and they're just a perfect storm of problems. And so we saw rises in the level of calls for service from police, the levels of calls to shelters, and in the level of homicides that were related to IPV. And these include murders of partners, murders of new partners by ex-partners, and vice versa, and others killed in the dispute. So if, for instance, a woman is killed by her partner, and so is her mother, that counts as a domestic violence death. So also we noted that the rise in violence overlaps with the move to permitless carry here in Texas in September 2021. And as you'll see, the rise in homicides committed with a gun also rose at a rate higher than the rate by other means. Another thing we noticed was that while overall homicides and non-IPV family violence homicides fell in 2022 in the HPD data, IPV homicides continue to rise. So when you look at the data in more granular detail, you see different variations in the trend that cause you to want to look at those particular dynamics, right? So I'm making the case for the importance of data. It's important to look at the data in order to be able to analyze it and then respond to the trends that you see. And then also noted there with the stripes are the suicides by perpetrators that are not included in the count since they are not homicides. And here's data on the weapon over time and overall. So you'll see that the red is IPV homicides committed with a gun, much higher. And here is the race, ethnicity, and gender of victims. You can see in that figure that the incidence of female homicide victims for IPV is much higher, 129% higher, and that there's a disproportionate presence of Black women victims. Black women made up 52% of the victims, though they comprise only 20% of Harris County women. And male deaths may involve being killed by female intimate partners, by male intimate partners, or by new partner, old partner conflicts. And sometimes there's also the issue of women being aggressors in male deaths, but they are actually defending themselves. So that's a complication that we'll maybe talk about. And the data suggests that 7 of the homicides cited involve same-sex partners. Here is some data on calls for shelter. Two shelters, specifically the Bridge Over Troubled Water and Hawk. And as you can see, there was a decline during the COVID period, and the data suggests that it has risen since then. There's a little decline again after the third quarter of 2022, but it's still higher than it was before COVID. People are higher. And those were specifically calls for shelter, and these are calls overall. So in the wider sphere, homicides are not the outcome of most domestic violence interactions. Data is complicated by the fact that many people don't call. So the kinds of data that you can look at are those that are available and try to track trends. But you always know that there's a large number that are not being heard from. So HPD received on average 25 to 27,000 calls for violence, calls for service around violence between 2019 and 2021. And it has reduced in 2022, but it's still high. And here is some data from the study around the issues of how, when people do reach out, where can they go? And one of the major factors that people report on is that frequently people are turned away because there aren't spots available in the area shelters. So in Harris County, there are 330 shelter beds available for a population of 4.7 million. And in the wider region, there are 475 beds. And we spoke as part of the study with comparable providers in New York City, which has twice the population of Houston, but has more than 10 times as many dedicated domestic violence shelter beds at 3,500. So that's one of the statistics that I think people found most shocking, that there was this big variation across cities, and that there was ongoing dispute. Of course, it's not ideal for everyone to go to a shelter. It'd be better for everybody to have affordable housing that they could move to and take their family to without concern that they wouldn't be able to pay the rent, which is frequently the backstory on people staying with domestic violence. But while you know that that's the goal, it in itself can't happen overnight, and we don't have that affordable housing available in our region. So this is part of the discussion, is how to expand. And I know that several of the providers now are expanding the number of beds that they can offer, building new buildings. But there's also development that occurred during the pandemic, which was access to hotels. And was funded by ARPA funds or earlier funds from the federal government. And there's room for discussion of how that might be funded going forward to accommodate overflow risk. I know that's an ongoing opportunity that is currently not available in the region. Some of the other things that we talked with providers about were the things that had changed in their units over time, over the period that we were talking about. And one of those that was particularly notable was longer stays. That people, if you have, for instance, 330 beds, and you understand that those are not 330 cases, because most of your cases, or many of your cases, meaning individual clients, are coming with family members, children frequently. So actually, instead of the 330 spots for different families, you're going to have closer to 200 spots for families, or even fewer. So that already means that you have a reduced set of individuals that you're able to provide service for. And then that gets further complicated when you realize that people just coming into your facility and staying overnight is not going to be sufficient for helping them get somewhere where they're not just going to come back 2 days later, right? Because if you can't assist people with finding a way forward that is sustaining for them and their families, you're not really doing the full job of helping them move forward. So many of the shelters have effectively been providing those services and finding that that means that people are staying for 30, 45, even 60 days in the shelters. And that further reduces the number of spots that are available for other people who are calling the next day. So that is a dynamic that people are ongoingly seeking to figure out, right? How do you balance these things? And then what are the best services to provide? And how can you best do that in order to assist people. So this is ongoing work that's happening frequently separately in each shelter. And as people talk with each other more, I think there's more sharing of information about what works or what doesn't work. And that's an ongoing collaborative opportunity as well. And then there's also been a recognition that many people don't have the means to get to the shelter, even if there were a spot. Transportation is a huge issue. And also people may not feel comfortable coming to a shelter. So there's been a big move toward mobile advocacy in terms of both locating more services in the community rather than expecting people to come to you. And some of our speakers can talk to that, the innovations that they're doing, and also dealing with issues of just building trust when people don't feel that they are sure that the people in the shelter are going to recognize their needs or treat them well. There's also been innovation in a big way around the community in terms of collaboration between shelters and law enforcement, in terms of DV high-risk team work and the domestic abuse response team that HPD and others are working with. Fort Bend has a separate program as well. Here's a map to indicate, we know that Harris County is a big county, and these red diamond shapes are the shelters. You can see that it's pretty far if you don't have a car to get where you might be able to get shelter. So I mentioned the housing issue. The Coordinating Council, in collaboration with the providers, does run a coordinated access housing queue to place survivors in affordable housing, sometimes permanent, sometimes limited duration, with case managers to assist. And this is tracked by taking an assessment of eligibility and some, if you're found to be eligible, then you get put on the list. And this is the number requesting, the number placed, and the number still in queue. So you can see that while there's a big effort and a great deal of positive work done in placing people, there's still a huge demand that can be met. So part of the work that we were doing was around, in talking to people, around getting a sense of how regional agencies have cooperated and worked together in the past. And the Coordinating Council has done great work of bringing people into the same room and getting people to work together. It's an opportunity for them to work together. But there's still essentially the issue that came over and over again is that people are so overwhelmed that it's really hard to do more than meet demand coming in the doors of your shelter or your agency. And so there hasn't been a lot of opportunity for people to step back and figure out how, for instance, there might be redundancies across agencies that could be collapsed into one that could create more efficiencies or other kinds of opportunities for collaboration that could make things, share information, just invent things together. And that has been happening incredibly across the pandemic. So the first thing I was impressed with was how much all of these shelters and their people who work in the shelters do and were doing all along. And then there was the enormous challenge of dealing with COVID and the huge rise in violence that it brought, that also was met in really innovative ways by the shelters who continue to work in multiple ways together and to invent new things to respond to the moment. So here's what they were doing before. So you can just look at this, you don't even have to read the list, you can see. So they were providing shelter and food and all the other necessities for survivors and their children. They were providing services in shelter for clients, for like case management, trauma therapy, childcare, job help, transportation, all these things that you would expect them to do, right? But then they were also doing services for non-residential clients, like helping people plan safety, because there's not, if you can't find a spot, or maybe you're not ready to go to the shelter, you want to have guidance on how to negotiate the circumstance that you're in, how to get out of it, how to figure out what's happening. There are just so many levels of that. So people on the hotline do a lot of work with non-residential clients as well, and have done all along. And then they run the hotlines. They continue to provide services for people, some people after they exit, those who there's a place for, like housing placement, counseling, job help, connections to the legal services world, medical services, mobile advocacy. There's also the whole realm I mentioned of community outreach and education that they are expected to take care of. That's sort of their realm, is violence and solving it. And so they do a lot of that, but it's certainly, there's room for a lot more. And then there's also the issue of managing and retaining their own staff who are dealing with highly traumatic situations. So that creates big problems. Then there's especially the issue of pay. This is a highly underpaid realm, and that creates its own traumas. And then they have to maintain pay equity for their people. So they have to do a lot of fundraising, and they have to work with the police, and they have to work with the courts. And I'm calling them up and saying, and what about your data? They have to try to track that as well. And then they have to be planning how to expand and doing fundraising. So I hope I've impressed you with how many tasks that they were doing to begin with, right? So this is already like a huge job that the shelters and providers do for the community. And then around COVID, and not all of them, but spurred by COVID, but many of them have been some of the innovations that I've already spoken about. And then there were the innovations around flexible funding that came from federal dollars that were actually big boom. So it was an odd mixture of overwhelming change in the negative sense, but also a big rise in the kinds of funds available through the ARPA and earlier dollars. So that did provide some opportunity for expanding services in new ways that now create the prospect of what will happen when those funds go away, and what is our community going to be doing to prepare for that moment, because we know that those funds are a boon in themselves, but they still leave much to be done. And if that then disappears, what's going to happen in terms of the ongoing response? So this is an opportunity for the community to have a discussion about these issues, because we still have a few more years left on that. But people tend, I know I do this too, tend to work to deadline. It's like, okay, we don't have to do that yet. But if you don't plan it now, it's not going to happen in time to be forestall that cliff that will come to at the end of 2024, 2025, when those funds are no longer available. And so what came out of the discussion was discussion about investing more in, and this is actually in response to that question that I was just raising in part, investing more now in the infrastructure of the collaborative, so that some of these basic kinds of innovations around data gathering and analysis, I could go off on that in great length. It's a very complicated process in this realm, especially around issues of client privacy, but also around data sharing across somebody who moves from one shelter to another, and lots of different factors. But this collaborative work could prepare the ground for future fundraising to bring in alternative funding in the next few years from federal sources, other sources. So this could be an opportunity, this kind of investment that the group asks for in terms of staffing the collaborative could be the opportunity to deal with that potential cliff coming up. And another part of it is sharing that data with the public consistently, right? So once you have the data, that's the opportunity to share it with the public and engage the public with trying to figure out, not just what the issue is, because people know that it is an issue, but what are the details on it, and because once you have the data, you can start thinking more in a more engaged way about what can we do about this. If you just know it's a big problem, it's sort of amorphous, it seems like something you can't address. But once you have specifics, you have a different way of engaging that can invite the public to start thinking about those things. So I think that having the data and then sharing it in a way that the public can understand and engage with, because this is not an issue that people don't know about, right? They maybe don't know about specific data, but they know about it in their families. They know about it in their neighbors. They know about it around them because it is endemic, right, in our community. It's not something that people are just interested in academically, right? So this is data that people need, even if it's not an immediate concern of theirs. It's something that can help them figure out what happened in their past, can help them figure out how to talk to their children. It can help them figure out how to deal with their neighbors and how to be part of a community discussion about how to make the community a place that people feel safe in and where people have recourse if they're in danger to a safe place regularly. So these are some of the opportunities that working more together could create. We also, in terms of the communications part, talked about having more advocacy on the part of the shelters. And this is, again, something that the shelters would have to work together on, what they wanted to advocate for as a group. And the Houston Area Women's Center shared an example of an initial set of issues that they had identified as important in 2021. And again, gun safety is a huge issue, as we saw in the data. The numbers of access to guns affects people's, can turn what might have been a fight into a murder, essentially. Whereas if you don't have that, it would be a different situation. And we know there's ongoing challenges to this. Guns also, in our interviews with survivors, are the tools of terroristic threat for many people. So you may not end up being shot, but somebody may be holding a gun to your head 3 or 4 times a day. And that is another dynamic that isn't as obvious, but it was definitely something that people were reporting in their interviews. So that's another aspect of the role of guns in lives of individuals in our community. Also focusing on increasing safety for survivors, expanding hotel access, issues of accountability for offenders. There's a whole set of issues related to the backup in the courts that we'll talk about a little later, and the backup in the jails. Those are part of results of Harvey in part, and parts of funding for prosecutors, and all different dynamics that coalesce and create a backed up system. And also the role of teaching in the community, which we'll also talk about, and how to avoid this in your own relationships, and how to notice when something like that seems to be happening or underway. So essentially, connecting the dots means recognizing as a community that violence is systemic. It's not something that's just those people happen to have that bad behavior, but it's something that comes out of this, the many stresses and the lack of many supports that bear down on people, as well as lack of experience with healthy relationships and, you know, basic things like decent wages that would, if you made enough to pay the rent somewhere else, you could leave, but if you don't, then you're sort of stuck. And whose fault is it that those fair wages aren't available? It's not that individual's fault, right? So it's the community is part of these decisions that create the dynamic in which this occurs. So a number of people made these points, and here's a quote from Emily Whitehurst, just essentially saying that basic infrastructure would address a lot of these problems. So that's part of what the community can discuss. That's what the community can be having a dialogue about. So we saw that there was disparity in issues of race, ethnicity in the homicides. There's similar disparity in who goes to shelter. So you can see here who's in the Hawk shelter for the past 2 years, as opposed to the breakdown of women in the in Harris County overall. So there's a major disparity, both among the Black and Hispanic populations. The Black population is higher than it is in the population, and the Hispanic population is lower. And that seems to be due to different kinds of problems that people face. The data suggests that Black women in economic precarity have fewer resources for assistance from family or friends, or for their own friends, their own funds. So more of them end up going to shelters, whereas others with other kinds of resource networks may go elsewhere. So it may also be the case that they face more violence because their abusers have fewer opportunities. And there's a whole other realm of discussion to be had about what is putting abusers into the stressful situations that cause them to become abusers. So that's another level of discussion that as a community we can have, because it's not a person, again, it's a systemic issue. It's not a personal choice per se, though one is responsible for what one does. That's a complex situation. And the other dynamic that I really struck me most, I think, was that inability to leave violence may in itself create violence. So if you don't have, if your abuser or potential abuser knows you could leave, the likelihood that they would abuse you would go down. I mean, it might still do that, but the fact that you could leave creates a different kind of dynamic. So it's more of a peer situation as opposed to a dependent situation. But if you're dependent, then the person may feel further stressed by needing to take care of you, you know, as well as by other, just feeling that that you can't do anything about it, you know, and that you're stuck. And then the issue around immigrant women in precarity, and particularly undocumented women, seems to have a big component of fear of deportation, where people, even if they would not be deported, most would not, because there is recourse for that. People are told by their abusers that they will be, and they believe that. So that may cause them to not go to a shelter as well. So I wanted to just share this little matrix here as a kind of way of thinking about some of these factors, social factors, systemic factors that weigh down particularly on women. And I think it's not only women in these dynamics, but particularly bearing children, which is specific frequently to the experience of women, and being responsible for children creates a special kind of pressure on individuals, as well as a kind of social pressure more broadly about how women's role is perceived. So, so it might have a double effect, both the effect in an individual life, but also the effect of what resources are available to people because of what people expect people will be doing. Unplanned fertility and violence are the high and low points here. But then the other factors that feed into that are limited access to education, which may link to unplanned, cutting off school, limited jobs choices as a result of limited education, low wages and dependency as a result, the extreme extra task of caregiving and responsibility that is loaded onto female frequently with mothers. I had a conversation with a researcher at one point, and she was giving a presentation, and she said, well, she was a hunger researcher, but talked to two people in the same family at the same table. It'll be the husband and the wife. We'll be talking about, how they feel about hunger in the family. And it turns out that the husband, because that's not viewed as his realm, doesn't worry about that. He has other things to worry about, but he's not worried about how to get food on the table. Whereas the mom is constantly worried about that. That's a level of action, but also thinking that in itself is part of caregiving that maybe isn't always thought of, and that can lead to depression and anxiety, can lead to food insecurity. Well, I guess it reverse can lead to acute health issues. Those can lead to pain management issues and sometimes to addiction. So you can see how all of these factors intersect, not for everybody, but in different ways, and that this is a factor in the experience of domestic violence. Domestic violence is part of it, and then the other factors also play in as well. So the recommendations that came from the study were that to strengthen the DV providers collaborative, it would be much helped by a investment, substantial investment over 5 years that could allow for the hiring of staff to actually coordinate all of these separate entities that do so much on their own, but that could do even more if they were strategically coordinated and staffed. Because just saying, oh, you should be doing more to an organization that's already strapped and over committed is not going to lead to anything. There has to be an investment, and it could be you can do things by halves. You could say, okay, we're going to make a little bit of an investment, but to really envision change, a substantial investment at this point would allow a transformation of the dynamic in the community that could then lead to further ripple effects of change. We also recommend improving data collection, both in the shelters and in the PDs and across the board. These are issues in the courts. They're issues just tracking what's happening is complicated and could be helped by an investment in those realms. And then out of the discussion, since the discussion, there have been a number of other things suggested that people could maybe think about doing. For instance, centralizing non-shelter survivor services in one place. Many cities around the nation have what's called a family justice center. That's an opportunity, sort of a one-stop shop for people. That would be difficult in our big county, so there would need to be thinking through of how that might work. But finding ways to centralize services seems like something that would be an opportunity to assist across the board. Expanding the beds through continued use of hotels. And then on background, this sort of enormous task of rethinking the way we function as a society. And again, people, when they think, oh, it's a big problem, we can't think about it. But I think that domestic violence in an interesting way could be a way into thinking about these bigger problems, because it's the symptom. And if you of all these background issues, and if you don't want to just treat the symptom, in order to actually engage with the issues, you have to start stepping back and thinking about, well, what do we value as a society, and how are we treating the most vulnerable people in our society, particularly, it turns out, women in Harris County. Not to say that men are not also being suffering as a result of wage inequities and many other inequities that would also assist in meeting this change. So it's not just change for women, but it's a way into thinking about the way we think about services for our community that could spur a dialogue. And specifically around issues like housing, women's wages, childcare, and access to after-school care that would allow mothers to work consistently. This is always my issue. Why does school end at 3 o'clock when work doesn't end until 5 o'clock? You're just putting women into basically a part-time work schedule that creates the possibility that they will be vulnerable to violence. And people don't connect those things. It's not like, oh, it's the school day that's creating the domestic violence. It's not the sole thing, but it's that kind of thing, right? Gun access. People are big into wanting their rights, but we have to think about the rights of the society overall. And then I think people have asked me multiple times, well, why do you think there's this rise, as if I were new? But the one thing that does occur to me is, well, we have been seeing that women's declining social status in our state around rights and self-control. And it doesn't seem completely disconnected from people feeling like, well, it doesn't really matter what I do to a woman. It's not really going to be taken seriously in this environment. So I feel like we also have to connect those dots, that there are issues across the board that we as a community have to talk about. So, whoops, what am I doing? I'm going to go back to my screen, but it won't let me. The screen says thank you. So thank you very much for listening. And I will note that there are a lot of issues that were raised in the report that we didn't have time to include. We didn't want to overwhelm you. But please do read the report or look at the executive summary and be part of that thinking through that I think our community is doing one way or the other, just because they're seeing this rise. And I'd like to invite the participants in the study who are present, both online and in the space. Those who are in the space, come forward and sit at the table, if you would. And we could start with the participants, and then we could go to, or everybody who has a name up front. Just come on. If you want. And there's Barbie. Hi, Barbie. So thank you so much for being here. And maybe just ask you, the first four of you, to introduce yourselves who were in the study, starting with Christina Allen.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christina Allen. I'm the CEO of Family Time Crisis and Counseling Center. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christina Allen, CEO of Family Time Crisis to operate shelters for children and who are survivors of domestic violence. In addition to providing background case management services and counseling services. So I'm the CEO of Eastern Carolina, and we too are a what we call a shelter and rural agency, which means that we provide shelter, we provide residential services that everybody was talking about, and we also provide services to, in addition to the violence part of it, we provide sexual violence part of it.
Good morning or afternoon. My name is Olivia Rivers with the River Troubled Waters. We're located out of Pasadena and minutes south here. And we provide all of this wraparound services that necessary. Emily Myers, who's very good at
Good afternoon, Keisha Jenkins with the Harris County Domestic Violence Community Council.
Good afternoon. I'm Amy Smith, also with the Harris County Domestic Violence Community.
And happy Monday. My name is Jason White. I'm with IRWGS Investigates. I got the honor to work with a lot of these young women up here. Very heartbreaking creatures.
Well, thank you all and welcome. And initially, we want to talk to the participants, and I should note that Barbie Brashear is on online. You want to say hi, Barbie?
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Elizabeth, for hosting this.
And Barbie is the Executive Director of the Harris County Domestic Violence Coordinating Council. So initially, my first question to you is, have you had response to the report since it came out? And in terms of your own personal response or other response and to the workshop process that was part of that development, the study involved?
As far as the response to the actual process of writing this report, I would say that I remember very clearly that I got the first call from Dr. Gregory, and I was so happy to be able to talk to someone about what had been happening during COVID, because I think we all were just functioning right and changing and trying to keep up with the changes that seem to come daily sometimes. And so the fact that I had an opportunity to really talk through a lot of the things that we had seen, not just with our clients, but also with our staff who are doing this work every day, was really something that resonated with me, because I thought at least someone is paying attention and is interested in what's going on right now.
If you want.
So I think one of the important things always is that have and always have is that. And so anytime you are taking the time to collect information that God is for example. One of these are
we probably haven't had any comments after before I would say we did have a lot of comments realizing that those of us that should be working with injury so much. Like I'm saying, school shut down. Many of us were still trying to figure out how to provide life-saving services, while also keeping our clients safe and protected from the pandemic.
understanding. So I think it's easy to kind of overlook the work that we do as being a first response, but we do have to move this phone calls. And I think the beauty of it is we were still able to do check-ins and recording council health monthly, if not bi-weekly at one point, just check in. And we just give it that camaraderie, like, we're trying to figure this out. Every day is changing, every day there's a new way to do something. And it also allowed us to be creative in how we do services. I think social services always is something that you see is face to face. Right, and so it allows organizations and to be very creative in how we use these advice services. So a lot of things that we discovered and learned how to do were trial and error, but it wasn't just one and allowed us to make sure that we were really meeting people where they are. I think that's something we hear a lot. We hear people are, but we're not actually believing it. We did a lot of stuff. One of the biggest problems in the country we handled it. We didn't, we're perfect, but I think we really did come together to support each other. Sarah, this kind of this support, it is just so valuable. Part of those rooms, I'm going to be sure for people to live here. Welcome to the post-pandemic hybrid world. It's very official. What I was trying to say was the value of a third-party validator who is grounding their observations and data. And with respect to the timing of this report, at least for the East Working Center, that data, which I don't know that you hit on so much today, or that in the last 2 years, that rate has doubled. The report came out the same day that Sonia and I were going before the city council for them to approve their investment in our new emergency support housing facility. So it was really remarkable that all happened at the same time. So here's this report that comes out, and we're literally going to get a vote from the city council. And then another one just happened where I'm sure you hopefully saw that this data was featured on the front page of the Houston Chronicle, and that was the same day we broke ground. So it's been really helpful in many ways to validate the work that we're all doing as a collective to be proactive in response to the alarming rise in violence.
Well, that's good that there was that coincidence. And I was just talking to someone about how frequently, a different coincidence in her experience. And what I feel is frequently the case is that coincidence is not around necessarily data, but around somebody doing some action and another domestic violence story occur all the time, right? That there are so many stories that it's almost predictable that something would be happening in that realm. Do you think that as a result of those, so part of what we're talking about earlier is communication. So data is the first part of the communication, and then it's getting the story out. You think that as a result of that, you're getting a different kind of response from people, that people have a higher awareness in addition to the city council? More broadly, are you getting different engagement around those issues? I
definitely think that this kind of report helps drive the conversation. And I know for sure, even if it's a little bit of a closer in group like our board of directors, report, we send in the articles, and I think that layer of supporters looks like people are here who are already somewhat connected or have put a little bit of a stake in the ground in their personal lives to do something about this, but aren't on staff dealing with it every day. It's been, I think, very helpful for those folks to, again, hear from somebody who is a third-party validator, expert with data that affirms our strategies and also drives this point that there's just, we need more, we just need more money.
And I also think it's really important because, as you said, it was on the front page of the Chronicle, and Matt, thank you so much for putting that on there. And then also, I don't think that without necessarily reported, we would have had a week-long initiative with ABRC that we all participated in. And so I think that's really telling, is that, it seems like that there's more awareness about it. I think some of the issues in the report, or the issues that were brought up in the report, are very startling and very telling that we are in the third or fourth largest city county, and we have so little resources. And I think that is really been eye-opening for a lot of folks. And our media partners have been great in trying to get the story out. I think spoke to almost every media outlet that we have here in Harris County in the 2 weeks after the report. So it was nice to see that we are getting coverage. And I don't, in a way, I want it to continue for awareness, but I don't want it to continue because of why it's out there for another domestic violence homicide. And all you can do is turn on the news, and that's right. I think you appreciate our media partner.
Yes, and I want to get to talking to the media representatives as well, because for exactly those reasons. But in addition, we have seen recently, and this is not related to this, but prior to that, in the recent past 2 years, we have seen the formation of a City of Houston Commission on Women, and also a Harris County Commission on Women. So those are transformations that may do something to also just raise awareness about this issue, but also about the connecting the dots issue around the set of concerns that intersect. Have you had interaction with either of these commissions or seen any results to their much yet to come? Well, I mean, it's a problem. So the issue of the having the study underway was that people were talking to each other around ways to innovate. We've asked the universe to donate to invest in a new way of building infrastructure for the DV community here in the county. And we hope that that will occur in some way or form. But even without that occurring, how has that affected the way you're thinking about working together at all? Because out of that discussion it was a discussion about working together. What would be the next?
I think that the report really reflects the need for the individual agencies to really truly combine efforts and work together to be able to advance some of the wonderful initiatives that we're doing in silos, right? So unlike any other issues that exist, when you think of these issues that are social services issues related to human needs, there is typically some mechanism in place for them to work together so that those voices can be combined, so the impact can be greater. And that is something that we have not quite applied yet as domestic violence agencies in this area. But I think through COVID, we all saw that in a very organic way, and we also see the data supporting that. Especially when we're comparing ourselves to other large community areas, as mentioned in the report, it really highlights the fact that there's been a void here. So, I had thought everyone on this panel and everyone who does this work in needs, but for a very long time, we have been on the phone, and it's been up to us maybe to figure out how to make it happen to rely on our own supporters, if you will, and our own advocates. And we could be doing so much more to address this issue if we were working together in a true collaborative manner.
And that's such a complicated issue, right? Because as someone noted, Sonia, there's a whole history to the domestic violence movement. And a lot of it has to do with scarce resources. And people, you can set up a structure for collaboration, but if everybody feels that they are strapped and not really able to collaborate for reasons of, not wanting to give away power that there's no guarantee anybody will then follow up on. There are just a lot of issues around that history that have promoted people working in isolation to some degree. I mean, this is my impression. Maybe you can speak to it.
I disagree with it. One of the, those are the things, and we hear has to be integration, and there's the qualification. On the shelter. So there has been some creation there. I was thinking I want to acknowledge too that the funding has not always been there, that so to that, right? This hasn't been funded in that way. Do it in the other way. So there's been attempts to my business. All of this talking here has been on board. In this time, this data, there's a better opportunity that to have data and do that is really true information.
And also the technology is coming. Yeah, that's it.
And to continue, I think I'm probably one of the newer ones. However, since I've been a part of this movement, I think that the idea and the hope of wanting to collaborate was there, but collaboration takes money, right? So you can say, let's get together and try to work collectively all you want, but you need that financial piece to make it work. So I would say over the last 10 years, it hasn't been about not wanting to release or relinquish power. It's about how do we do it in a way where we are paying our advocates at a decent wage to do this extra work in collaboration, or having the funding to create those systems so that we can collaborate. So yes, the history is there, but I think we can continue to say historically, but moving forward, we want to collaborate, but we need that funding to make sure it's effortless and that it's seamless, so that when survivors are going through that process, you don't have all of those hiccups. So I think it just takes some navigating, but I think the idea and the passion and the heart of wanting to truly collaborate is present, maybe more so than it has been in the past.
And I also think you have to look into like how things are funded. You also have to look into how things are funded. And part of that is that some of the funding, you have to have matching dollars. And that's a huge stumbling block sometimes when you don't have enough matching dollars. You have to follow certain guidelines. You have to follow some of your funding is tied to specific things, which means that you can only use it for specific purposes. And it's usually, and so that makes it a little more difficult. And then I think as Dr. Gregory pointed out in the report, the reports that have to do with funding are blankety blank horrible to do, and having to cut down to like the minutes of what your advocates are doing, and then it takes time for them to do the reports, so that's taking time away from what they can be doing because you have to document everything. So it makes it a little more difficult sometimes. And then just I think the best thing that has happened is flexible funding. We received the money with the CARES Act, where we were able to give stipends to all of our clients. And then in the last year, Commissioner's Court passed with the Affordable Care with the ARPA money. We also got some funding, and that went to the Coordinating Council, which was able to go out to 20 different agencies to be able to have flexible funding. And I think that's what's really important. Is it's not just getting funding; it's getting funding that you can use that's not tied to something.
That issue of compliance and just having to report, to send follow-up documentation to funders was raised by every single of the people interviewed. It's just a huge issue, and you could see an immediate savings in, centralizing that and writing one report that does that. But of course, you would have to get your funders to agree that they would accept that, or that, they would allow that structure. But if you could create an administrative structure that was everybody else fed into, then that could be the task of an administrative group, and everybody else could be focused on actual services. But again, you have to step back and create the environment in which that is agreed to by the funders, right? So, and it's that kind of thing that centralization could assist. And it only would happen through discussion, right? Of featuring what are the issues here, and how do we make sure that everybody, if you are getting a centralized grant from one funder, for instance, gets equitable division of those fundings, so that they don't feel like, oh, I could have done better if I'd done it myself. So, there's that kind of part to complexity to work out, but that was a huge issue in terms of time spent doing things that don't seem to have an obvious positive impact on the actual problem that they're being funded to support, to address. Lisa, did you?
I just want to add one more thing about the collaboration piece. I totally agree with all the panelists about the collaboration of the domestic violence service providers. I also want to extend that conversation to our community at large as far as collaboration. Because here's the thing, we have all the service providers. However, what happens, so the reality is that most people, when they're entering in to leave an abusive relationship, it may not be with one of these partners up here. It may be with their OB-GYN. It may be with their pastor, their priest, imam. And so part of that collaboration conversation also goes with how we're collaborating in the community. Case in point, as the training director with the agency, I get calls from nurses and doctors I've done trainings with, and I like to share stories, and I'll do it very briefly. Had a nurse who called about 2 weeks after a training on doing the danger assessment. She calls me and she wants through all the process that she has done, working with a woman who was an immigrant from Russia. And I sat there and I was amazed looking at the phone, because she had did everything the domestic violence advocate would have done. She went through everything that she had been trained on. And so that's the beauty of extending this responsibility from all of these agencies and putting it into the community, because it is a community issue. The 33% of women who report to an emergency room are there because of intimate partner violence. So we have to also extend that conversation to our community.
That's a key point. So maybe we could also ask Jason, and I don't know if other reporters in the room would like to come up and talk about the piece of both the role that press plays in getting the stories out to the community, both about what's happening and what the causes and response might be, but also the effect that it has in your newsrooms on having to report on those issues so frequently.
Well, sometimes I can't tell. For me, I'm a newbie to the state. So I think for our team, when it came to KPRC2's investigate team, we saw a plethora of domestic violence cases that had happened. And they happened very quickly. And it to the point where we were all just taking notice that we were doing these stories multiple times a day. I think in January, out of the 31 days, we reported on one or more domestic violence cases 26 times. And sometimes they happen in doses. I'm sure you see them as well. And sometimes they're kind of sporadic. But for us, I think there was a case where a woman lost her head. And that was the straw for us. And, to kind of go back to talking to some of these points that these folks are talking about, we individually called them for their data. We called every domestic violence related organization account. Then little Miss Gregory over here gives us a call and says, I'm about to drop a report. And it really did solidify everything that we were looking at. And it gave us that data that we were able to see for years past. And some of that data in working in news, and I've worked all over this country, a lot of it just comes from them. So we have to attribute it to the nonprofits. And if the nonprofits don't have those resources to be able to do their jobs, They can't give us the data, so we give the same generic responses of what they have to say. So when we have the data, and we can have, the third party come in and say, here's everything. We can actually go back and reference that multiple times. And I think collectively it helps out all together.
Yeah, I don't know that I'm gonna say anything that hasn't been said already, but I think you kind of see a lot of this anecdotally. But when you're talking about domestic violence homicides, I think that feels like a statistic that should be easy to get, but it's not, because there are so many different offices and entities involved in kind of keeping that data or not keeping that data. And I think seeing it all together kind of helps drive home that point.
And even if it's not all together, it's just part of it, even a subset of the data aggregated starts to make a difference. Yeah.
And I think one of the obstacles to collecting the data is how it's collected. Because I think when you said we have 80 something law enforcement agencies, they collect in 80 different ways. So looking at the information from the Houston Police Department and the Harris County Sheriff's Office, they collect it differently and they label things differently. And that's very hard to dig through and to try to find. One of the things that the Coordinating Council has done since the pandemic is we have a weekly meeting with law enforcement, and it's with the Sheriff's Department, HPD, and Pasadena PD. But even getting them to agree on some of what the how you call things or how you title things, or even like trying to pull data from some of their archaic databases is just amazing. And to quote one of my favorite lieutenants, I won't name the agency, but you put garbage in, you get garbage out. And so it makes it very difficult sometimes to pull accurate data as well. And that's part of the problem. And I think we all keep data, and most of us that have brands keep it the same way, except for we keep it maybe in a little different spaces or whatever. But when you're trying to pull it all in together, it makes it difficult sometimes when people say I can be, which is intimate partner violence, domestic violence, family violence, and then they have different ways that they count things.
So one of the other things that I was just going to say about the data is that what a great opportunity it is, because we're getting data from University of Houston, from you, Dr. Gregory, but it's an opportunity to also look at this issue through that public health. And it really is, we are in a public health crisis. And it's an opportunity for us to look through that lens collectively and really address it that way. Because in case you didn't notice on statistics, people of color, women and women of color are the most impacted. And so if we do not look at it that way, we're never going to really address it. I think that that's important. But what a great opportunity this is, because ultimately I think we're developing strategies that will help us have a healthy community.
And I want to know my colleague, Zach Huff here, who is working with a number of shelters on exactly these issues, because as you noted, there's such a variation in the way data is collected. And certainly across all the PPs, across the, if you look at the data in reports, you look at the data at every level, and you're seeing a big mishmash, big, and then you can't report that. You have to refine it. You have to figure out how to talk to people to start getting the data in a way that is correlatable. So we've been working on that. Zach is great.
One last thing that I would just say is that it's fine. We should always be looking at that.
And that's a good segue to talking to Tisha, who is thinking about these things all the time.
Prevention.
Yeah.
I think it's so important. As I was listening to you, Dr. Gregory, and I think I'm all about affirmation. Let's give Dr. Gregory and her team a round of applause. all people who are data-driven. I am not. It is about that strategy into place. And so as I listened to you and I was taking notes and definitely concurring that looking at the numbers that communities of color definitely seem to be more at risk. However, it is the community at large. And for me, that primary prevention piece, talking about healthy relationships. You know, most recently this weekend, I believe it was Saturday morning or Sunday morning in Baytown, there was an incident of domestic violence. And here's the reality is that I do believe that domestic violence is preventable and the homicides are preventable. However, here's the thing, having the opportunity to do this work for 27 years, going into classrooms with you, and then also being able to talk with adults like ourselves, is that it's about looking at mindset. That we have to create a new narrative mindset in our community at large. However, we're focusing today on Houston and Harris County. And so going in and having those conversations about what constitutes a healthy relationship. Within the last past year, I had the opportunity to go into colleges and universities. And what I am hearing from our young people is that as I talk about what constitutes domestic violence in a relationship, the isolation, the verbal and emotional needs, you know, and they're looking at me like a deer looking at headlights. Lady, that's normal. Houston, we have a problem. We have a problem. So it starts with something as simple as introducing the concept of healthy relationships. How do we learn to reparent? I had the opportunity this weekend at a church event, and I began to share the information because no matter where I am and whatever the topic is, I want to integrate this. And I had several people come up and say, thank you for bringing this. Nobody ever talks about this in our community about this. And I believe people want the information. We have to create those relationships, create those collaborations to go in and begin to change the narrative about what constitutes a relationship. Stop pushing people into a relationship and not preparing them for the relationship. That is imperative. So that is the start, is talking about what constitutes a healthy relationship. Because if we have that as a baseline, guess what? Further upstream, it is preventable. I know this is calling me out of my name, and that's not normal. Even though it may be happening in my home, I have a higher expectation. Let's raise the level of expectation through education.
Dr. Gregory, may I add something?
Yes, Barbie.
Hi, everyone. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. This is such an important conversation. And one of the things that I just wanted to add is how, you know, Dr. Gregory, you and your team undertaking this report and doing and meeting with the agencies has really underscored the fact that from the beginning, this has been under-resourced, underfunded, understaffed, underutilized from the very beginning. The agencies that you see here and all of the agencies that are involved in providing direct services to clients are doing enormous work. And I can't underscore that enough. An enormous work with very limited resources to address the true need. That's the reality. And I think what the data is starting to show is giving the greater community just a small snippet of that as the picture, right? We're just getting there. And I think along with applauding you, Dr. Gregory, it's applauding, you know, these agencies, the Bridge, Family Time, Houston Area Women's Center, Bay Area Turning Point, Fresh Spirit, all of the agencies that are working in this space, doing the best they can with, again, overworked, understaffed, under-resourced. You know, there's a reason why we have the largest turn-away rate in the state for those that are calling for shelter. And it's all of those reasons that I just described. So I think that we haven't right-sized in our community. We haven't right-sized the funding and the resources to the need, if that makes sense. And that speaks directly to what Theisha's talking about as well with prevention, you know, so we have interventions and preventions all in this world of what we need to be doing and how we need to be addressing and working to end, women being killed in our community. And, we can't do it alone.
Thank you, Barbie. That is just the right way of phrasing it, that right sizing the resources to the need. And I think that is what hasn't been discussed, and there's been a kind of philosophy of scarcity. And I think Sonia and Emily use the term abundance as the way to counter that view of scarcity. And it suggests the dynamic of what's being invited from the community is to start thinking about how you're investing in the sphere overall, and including in the people that you're asking to do the response to this horrible violence that's occurring in our community. And then they effectively are being abused functionally by the community as well, because they're being under-resourced. So there's a need to recognize that the need is there across the board, and that's the responsibility of the community to assist and to support the work that's being done in such wonderful ways by these individuals here and all their co-workers, those online as well. I see Dr. Terrell, you have a question. Welcome.
Hi, just not a question, just a comment. Thank you so much, Dr. Gregory, for this information. And we all are here knowing exactly, feeling exactly what you are pointing out, the scarcity, and then also the under resources. And it is not but a handful of us. I was listening to the stats about all of the shelters and the spaces that's in New York. It's not but a handful of us that are actually doing the work. And even in that, we're still, I'm speaking as for Fresh Spirit, we're still constantly having to fight to prove we are doing the work. Yes, we need the funds, whether it's whatever funds that are out there, whether it's VOCA, whether it's the other funds that we've applied for. And there's only so many people out here that are actually doing the work. You would think that we would at least be able to get the funding and the resources from the county, the state, and whoever else, private funding to actually do the work, at least the ones that are definitely doing the work. So it gets to be frustrating, but thank you so much. And I applaud all of my DV sisters there. I also I couldn't be there in person, but we just keep pushing on. Thank you so much, Dr. Gregory.
Thank you. And yes, this was another point that kept being raised, that not only are people doing all this work, but the work of doing the compliance is not funded. Yeah. So you have to find other sources, philanthropic sources, to pay to do the compliance work on the funding. It's a little bit ridiculous when you think of it that way.
So there's such an august, robust conversation that needs to take place around all of these issues that are being raised. I know as a leader, and I'm sure everyone on this panel agrees, that when we ask our staff to continually do more, to show up more, to add this to your plate, oh, here's one other report that I need you to start doing on a monthly basis. And they can go work at Buc-ee's and make more money than what they're making at our agency. That is a problem. And it is not because anyone doesn't want to pay staff more, but we often have restrictions. We get pushback and questions sometimes on what people are paid. We have to provide justifications, but also we just have a finite amount of funds to work with. And so I don't want it to be overlooked in the midst of all this wonderful information that's being shared, that there is a level of vicarious trauma that our direct service staff and those who are doing this work every day take on. And I think that came to the forefront also during COVID and during, the Winter Storm Uri and all these things that happened, because we realized that we have to take care of the staff so that the staff can take care of the client. And it's difficult. And so the powers that be who are listening or who are not listening really need to take some time to talk to those of us who are doing the work about what those needs truly are so that we can get to what Nisha talked about and what Sonia talked about and what everyone has talked about today. Everyone needs to at least be able to make a living wage, but more than that, to do this work because it's literally a matter of life and death.
For making those very important points. And the dynamic, I mean, I understand that even your being here today is, you know, another pull on things that you have, other things that you also have pressing. So I know that you know, having workshops and sharing information is an important part of the dynamic, but it also requires back funding to make sure that there's somebody back at the office who is continuing to do the work while you can be out in front speaking to the public. So appreciate your doing this. And I also take your point that there's an opportunity for doing a lot more focus sharing because this is a huge overview. And I do reiterate that people please do look at the report, but even there's a lot of information. There are many, many other aspects of the domestic violence situation that are not accounted for there and that need to be part of the discussion as well. So there's an opportunity for doing more of that work, but it requires paying people to participate in the work. And you know, you don't get from scarcity to abundance in a minute, but you do get, we can move forward in terms of thinking responsibly about how we can help people to help people, which is, you know, so that people can be able to deal with all the trauma that they're seeing, because it's not like we're going to ask people to do something. We want to pay them well in order to do something that involves moving things around the desk, you know, pieces of paper. It's actually encountering trauma themselves, and if they've had that experience, it can be re-traumatizing for them. You know, there are a lot of levels of trauma involved in the work. So we have to be responsible in the way we think about compensating people. And again, this is an issue for the community to, you know, we want to reiterate. And maybe, I don't know, Tisha, you were talking about potentially putting things online, making resources available to people online so that you could be, people could come to the coordinating council's website and, you know, find guidance around some of these issues. You want to address them?
Yes, thank you, Dr. Gregory. So going back to the idea of collaboration and launching a new project, it is a result of collaboration. Collaborators from the Bridge of Waters, Family Time and Elmo. We also collaborated with the Division of Children's Assessment Center, and we are launching an online teaching portal using Teachable. And it was born out of education, having a seminar, a virtual webinar, probably about almost a year and a half ago, on the effects of domestic violence on children and youth who witness domestic violence. And in the aftermath, I put out a call and said, hey, would you like to continue this conversation? And had people who reached back out and said, yes, I would love to have a further conversation. And so we created a task force, and the whole idea of that task force was to be able to provide online education for our educators. Because when we talk about the pandemic, we know that our educators have been impacted so much by the pandemic. Their plates are overflowing, and then you know all the things that are happening now in our community with our school district, and so they are overwhelmed. So to even have the agencies come in and say, hey, we'd like to do an in-service with your staff, that's probably not going to happen. And so we thought, you know what, we're going to bring it to you where you can do it on your time. So we now have an online portal using experts, collaboration of UP agencies and other service providers, bringing information about domestic violence and its impact on children and youth. And so we're rolling this out, and we'll be marketing it to our local school districts. And the teachers simply sign up, and they can go through like a 15 to 20-minute lesson. And it's simply to give them tools. We have someone from DIA who has created a very robust a resource guide, because many times we get a survey asking about the level of information that, education that teachers thought they had around domestic violence. And one of the questions asked was, would you know what to do? And many of them said no. And I think that's what happens with those who are outside of the domestic violence community, is that if I get an affirmative that this family is dealing with domestic violence, what am I supposed to do? So that is also part of this online portal, is to be able to provide that educator with resources. And again, that is collaboration. So we like extend this information to the larger community.
Dr. Murphy, I wanted to go back to what Christina was talking about the trauma, being trauma informed, but also during the vicarious trauma. When you look at our advocates and the folks that work with us, that work with us, that are our partners in our agencies, they're not only is it low wages, they don't have affordable health care. They have a lot of the same issues as their clients have. And, you know, so we're asking a lot of the folks that work for us, and let's face it, most of the people that work in this movement are women. They also have their own issues that they have to deal with. They also have their own childcare issues. They also have their own healthcare issues. So not only are we asking them to take on responsibility for their clients, we're also not providing them mental health services. We're not providing them appropriate health care. And sometimes, you know, you kind of look at it and you think, how are we helping them? Are we giving them mental health days? Are we giving them self-care days? Are we paying them better? Are we allowing them, you know, maybe to pay for their insurance so they can get kind of a break also? And then sometimes when we, you know, have fundraisers, you know, we don't say, hey, why don't you just come to the fundraiser? No, we need your help. We need you to work even more on top of what your normal thing is to help us raise money for our clients, not necessarily for you. So it makes it sometimes a little more difficult to attract and to keep staff, because again, you can go to Buc-ee's and make more money. You can have a one shift. You're not worried about the phone call you're going to get in the middle of the night for someone wanting shelter. You're not going to worry about the client that you had to leave because you had to go home and take care of your child or your pet or your husband or your partner of some sort. And so we don't take that into account as well. I mean, I think every single one of us that work in this movement dread those phone calls you get in the middle of the night, or even if your staff is like, I don't know what to do, what do we do? So I think that we really need to focus on making sure that the people that work in this field have the appropriate resources as well.
Are there further questions from the people online, or points that people wanted to make? Because we can go now to the questions from the audience. There's so much more to talk about, but we want to leave time for people to ask questions. I don't know. You can go in the chat. Are there questions from those present?
Hi, my name is Linda Dewar-Smith, and I've been involved with this business since 1955. First of all, I want to say, this is going to sound, we have come so far, and this is so magnificent, and this wonderful clearinghouse, this Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality that we have now in the clearinghouse, all of you all, it's 1,000 times better than what we had in number 4 Chelsea Place long ago. But I do want to say quickly 2 things. I was a teacher in HISD for 33 years, and I taught middle school and elementary, and I taught 4th grade. And we have the most wonderful program, and we need to make sure it is everywhere. It's called Project Charlie. It was a moral type program, but it taught children refusal skills. It was teaching them healthy boundaries. And of course, we were addressing cigarettes, alcohol, and other drugs, but it would include anything that you felt uncomfortable and how to refuse and extricate yourself from the situation. So in order to have that relationship that you were talking about, you're old enough to be forming those, you have to have the healthy boundaries and all of that. And then back one step further. Years ago, Marlon Thomas came up with a record called Free to Be You and Me. And part of that was question be a question. So it had to do with parenting. And so if a parent overwhelms and dominates the child and the child has no agency, then he or she is set up as a tiny child to be victimized. So in parenting, there has to be a way to respect the boundaries of the child and keep your child healthy boundaries. So those are things I'm going to throw out. And one last thing, long ago, when all of us were young and we were fired up like so many young people are to be involved with health, we had, I'm not just advocating for now, but we had NOW chapters, National Organization for Women, all over the place, all the way up north, south, east, west. So if I'm a person, I don't know what to do, I don't know where to go. Well, if I join that, I'm just using that as an example for the group that we have many choices, many places, and so we could be on their domestic violence task force and become active. So all of that grassroots rose up to lobby and do a lot of that.
That's a great precursor for where we are now. And it just, for your example of parenting skills, it just indicates how widespread the issues are. I mean, they're like molecular. They're part of our culture at every level. So you can't just address it in one kind of way. You have to think in the big picture. And having resources online would be one way to allow people to access information that they might not feel comfortable calling for, and just something they can get access to at 2 a.m. or whenever it's helpful to them. So okay, so yes, Karen.
So where's one?
First of all, thank you very much for your comment, and I love that you mentioned Fort Chelsea. It was the very first piece scenario. One of the things, thank you very much. I think, there in our community, there are so many organizations, so many people who care about children, and who also know that children are impacted by violence, whether it's domestic violence or community violence, like we know all of those things. I think one of the really amazing things that we could do, in addition to finding the resources online, is that HISD actually uses a social and emotional learning sort of component to all of HISD. So it's making sure that they are truly invested in that actually is really the upstream part, right? And the upstream is really prevention. And we know that prevention has to be comprehensive. What we do in our organization is prevention. We're trying to stop that cycle, particularly for children. But in private prevention, each of our clients will be stopping that before it happens. And I believe that social emotional learning that HISD can actually roll out if they want to look at it, it can sort of stop. It's not based in that way.
Yes, I was thinking like the Project Charlie fit right into that aspect.
And while I firmly believe in trauma-informed care, I think we have to take it to the societal level, right? Because trauma-informed care focuses on what's happened to the individual. And I know the Bridge and so many of our sister agencies are moving into a healing-centered engagement formula, which talks about collective healing, like looking at society and the causes when it happens there, and then sharing those stories, telling those stories, using that as part of the healing process, which they do. I mean, it started with working with youth for that. And so I see us as an organization, as a collective, moving towards that, because you can't focus on the trauma, which asks what happened to you, what's wrong with you, but the healing-centered approach is what's going on in society that we are allowed to continue to see these things to happen with no response. So when you have these amazing programs that so many of our organizations have created towards, youth, and then you're blocked in the schools, right? You can't say certain words, you can't use certain phrases to really talk about the things that are happening to youth. And so we have to, work through all of that and manage to turn it over towards and manage to, do all of that. So I love what you said, because that really is getting back to, sometimes you do have to go back to the grassroots, right? I think we are really hyped up and like doing all of these really innovative things, and that's so important. However, sometimes you have to go back to the basics. And I think that starts with, if you think about societies across the globe, the campfire, right? That's where stories are told, that's where healing happens, and getting back to that campfire, those campfire moments, so that we can be truly engaged in primary prevention. Because we are seeing, when we're in the high schools, we're seeing, and even the middle schools, kids are already in abusive relationships. So it's, at Sonia's point, it's no longer prevention, you're still doing intervention. So how do we even engage there? So you're right, that parenting, so clutch, so key. And so I love all of these conversations, but again, and I'll let you take the mic, moving from trauma-informed to healing-centered is something I'm always going to advocate for.
I wanted to go back to the collaboration aspect of it because you keep hearing this conversation come up, and that's kind of where we came into play, is collaborating with all of these folks, because us as the media, like, we do have a responsibility to talk about what is happening outside in this world that we all get push notifications for. But on the other side of it is that, you know, we saw during our engagement, during our live chats, we had more than 100 calls of people calling in for help, first-time helpers. And it was a lot of these organizations that were like, hey, we're not here in your neighborhood, but if you call this partnering agency, we'll be able to help. And for those people, a lot of them, they didn't have that access before. So the collaboration goes on across just more than political boundaries, or just the lines that we put in our area that says we are Harris County, because, you know, we got calls from Fort Bend as well. We got calls from Walter. So there's other places that needed that help. And if it wasn't for the collaboration or the being able to do a live chat, you mentioned, you know, the campfire stuff, and we brought everybody in around the, we thought, kitchen table. You know, like, nobody talks better than around a table. So that's why we had a backstory here. Before some of these fine folks came and joined us during our Breaking Free live chat, we had it all in our newsroom, but we wanted to, like, strip it down. So we just moved everything out into our hallway. We kind of made it like a kitchen type scene and let these folks talk, because the conversation that comes out of that continues to come, the emails that came after that, like, that's where we got to see the real help come from. And it was something small, something on the ground level, and something that everybody get partnered together with.
So having these collaborative discussions, having everybody be in touch with one another so that data can be shared, and then it can be shared out by all these different meetings, either through modules on different topics that people can access if there are interest, to just getting resources out to people, as well as some kind of analysis of what are the issues and what should we be thinking of as a society in terms of not treating the symptom, but treating the cause. As has been noted, are all part of this response. It's a joint response. Everybody in this room or at this table is a first responder. I also wanted to say, is Brenda Sykes online? If you had any comment, Brenda, before we close. Let's see here. Or any other providers who are maybe online. Because I have to say that for me, it has been so inspiring, and I've been so impressed by all the people that I have spoken with in the course of doing this research, just how dedicated and innovative and collaborative a group this is, responding to the needs in the community. That I would say that our community is very lucky to have people who are doing this day after day, and to have press who are reporting on it and caring about it as well. As well as to, you know, all the dynamics and across the board. But again, at every level, we're seeing under-resourcing, we're seeing failure to support the dynamics that would allow people to thrive, as opposed to having their own negative experiences and also sharing that with their children, which is, you know, it's very hard to interact. It's very hard to teach someone out of a circumstance in which they themselves are having to engage. And along with the teaching, you want to be able to offer resources so that people can step away and transform their experience, which would also be a transformation of our community's experience, because the experience of the individuals is the experience of the community in so many respects. I have learned from talking with you all. So did anybody want to make any other point? Yes. Oh, sorry.
Thank you all for the work you've done on domestic violence. We all need to appreciate those hours put in. My name is Lori Adams, and I don't like to admit my age, but I will tell you that I was one of the first members of the board of Scenario Women's Center in 1982. Since that time, I've served as the president of the Texas Association of Mediators. I'm a family mediator, and I've done a lot of divorce work. I've had a client. In her memory, I really thought about my future work, and maybe my years are limited. But in the days I have left, I decided that instead of treating the problem, we have to fight the cause. I'm so pleased to hear certain things like domestic violence is systemic. Yes, it's systemic. I'm glad to hear that we need to have a cooperative effort, a collaborative effort. And I'll tell you that several weeks ago, I started a new project. It's called Change Agent. Change Agent is for any individual, business, or organization who wants to commit to preventing and managing problems or conflict. So I am now just trying to change my focus from treating the problem to managing and preventing it. So I'm really thrilled to hear about your intention approach. And I'll tell you right here, I have a flyer, and many of you in the room, I'm sure, are familiar with the power and control wheel. On the back is one called equality. And so this is about healthy relationships. I think we need to concentrate as much on healthy relationships. And in my Change Agent project, I'm hoping to get this flyer in as many households as possible. And Emily, I was going to talk to you after the luncheon, because I know you're very busy this week, but I've already talked to people at ABDA, and we like to put some QR codes on this flyer for the power and control and also quality relationship. Everybody in the room here will be involved as a change agent, and I hope you will do that.
I think we see some change agents, right? And yes, we have to expand that to the community and invite them all into work, because they're already being heard.
I just want to mention also the business sector, trying to find a way for the business sector to be effectively galvanized. We know, there's data that shows over $1 billion a year is lost in productivity due to domestic family violence. And I did want to pitch a safety planning saves lives campaign that the Scenario Women's Center launched last week. Gratefully in partnership with the business community, not completely, but in large part. So we're really trying to help provide direction for that sector, which is also in its own way on the front line, but potentially not thought of as a primary collaborative partner, and they truly are. So if you want to learn more about this campaign, you can go to www.pop.org/safety planning, and it's another very easy way for people to feel empowered to proactively engage in saving lives.
Great, another place, a way into that people will pay attention to their employers as well as their educators, get people's attention and provide guidance on how relationships how to function. Okay. Oh, sorry, Sarah.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I'm a graduate student in Women's Studies at TWU. And a question that I had, I know we're ending on a really good note, and I do want to make note of how a question that I had was in regard, and this was touched on in Dr. Gregory's presentation of the data of, you know, how the communities, especially Black and Brown communities, feel with the lack, with the distrust that they feel, right? And so, especially with the increasing rates in marginalized communities and police brutality, how are, this is open to anyone that can answer, about how are nonprofits, communities, agencies confronting these and kind of making sure to, like, you know, especially nonprofits working through law enforcement, how are you confronting that? How are you transforming that? And how are you making sure that you are still holding that safe space for survivors, for victims to come forward, but who are also coming from communities that are distrusting of law enforcement, while also working with law enforcement. So, yeah.
I do know that both the major law enforcement agencies, the Sheriff's Office and HPD, have started new community engagement pieces. During the pandemic, I believe it started right before the pandemic, and then it went through the pandemic. HPD started a class that all their law officers had to, all their officers had to, no, actually all their employees had to take, and it was called Building Trust Through Trauma. And it was created by Chief Cheryl Victorian, who is now the chief in Waco. She was the assistant chief here. And it was building that, going through and looking at what has happened with HPD through the years, and taking that and trying to teach officers that you need to be more aware of your history and why things are happening as they are. I know I taught it was taught with a nonprofit person as well as a sworn officer. I know I taught the class. I know Sonia Perales also taught the classes. It was interesting to see the change in some of the officers as they went through that class, especially the younger officers that had no idea about the history of police brutality with HPD, especially about the Joe Campus Torres incidents, about I can't remember the name of the woman who was killed on the freeway. It was about some of different things, and looking at those and seeing how you can address those through a lens of, okay, this is what's happened, but let's try to address this.
And I also think, you know, in educating law enforcement, and I've had that opportunity for about 2 years ago in do training. And one of the things that I began implementing is that we had a pilot project for survivors who are actually accompanying these trainings, and to particular who are women of color, that they are having these open and honest dialogues with the officer. So it becomes personal. It's about when the officer is saying, so tell me why you didn't call, that they're able to share their lived experience and say, this is why I didn't call. And so I think bringing in the voices of the survivors of color, to actually have those one-on-one conversations, because I am miseducation advocate all through and through my bones. However, here's the reality, and sometimes you just sit down and have a conversation with someone, and that's where the real growth can happen beyond the theory, if you will. And so that's one of the strategies that is being used to actually bring in those survivors of color to actually sit down and have a conversation.
I think another thing is like really getting to what community policing is about. And so finding your officers of color who are willing to be down in Pasadena. We have several of our officers who come regularly to our shelter just to spend time with the survivors and the children. They want them to know we are safe, right? But you don't only want to call them when there's trouble, right? And then to Tisha's point of those stories, why are we not calling them? Because I want my abuser to stop hitting me, but I also don't want you to come with guns drawn, right? So having those critical conversations and telling officers that, actually being able to look at, so calling them in, like, yes, we know it's not every officer, but it is a lot. So let's have those conversations and have accountability across the board in the community. So what community policing looks like is you're coming, you're being a part of our community, not just when dad is, you know, or mom is, they're hitting each other, but also just for the good things too. So I can start seeing you as someone who I can come to and I can recognize as a safe person.
Thank you. That was a great question because there's so many issues that, you know, because you're depending on the police department and at the same time, you know, that issues of racism and police officers may also be abusers themselves. And, you know, they're part of the community and these are factors that affect across the board. So training is a huge part of it, but there's support for people to know that they have recourse to other realms as well, so that that's not their sole point of recourse, because again, the infrastructure and the collaboration across factors is huge, because there is a lot of innovation happening in collaboration with police departments right now. So that's a very positive thing, but it has to be kept balanced with the factors. So thank you everyone for participating online as well as here in the room, and also for participating in the study. I hear from this discussion that we need to have a little module discussions online touching on all the